Matavai Bay, Tahiti, March 23, 1791. The warship HMS Pandora pulls into the bay. With 24 guns and a crew of 134, it is far larger and better armed than the prey it's chasing, the mutineers of His Majesty's armed vessel Bounty. Though finding them does not take long. Within hours, 3 men approach the ship. At first, Pandora's crew thinks they're Tahitians due to their tattoos, but when they pull themselves aboard, they declare themselves to be from Bounty. Young gentleman Peter Heywood, midshipman George Stewart, and armorer Joseph Coleman. All claim to be loyalists, either left behind or forced into the mutiny. And they'd looked on Pandora as a rescue, especially when they see their old friend Thomas Hayward. He'd been a midshipman on Bounty, one of the loyalists abandoned with Bligh. Surely he would vouch for them. But instead, he identifies the men and proceeds to have them shoveled into a makeshift prison built onto the deck. A wooden cell so small they can barely crawl. A cage that will come to be known as Pandora's box. This Global Manhunt is brought to you by Ground News, who we thank for supporting this historical tale's epic conclusion. There was one ironclad rule in the Royal Navy. Do not lose one of His Majesty's ships. Ships were expensive, and to lose one for any reason automatically triggered a court-martial for its commander. William Bligh was very aware of this, so even before he left the Dutch Indies, he was already laying the groundwork for his defense. He wrote letters to the Admiralty laying out the events, pressured his loyalist sailors to sign a document stating Bligh was not at fault for the mutiny, and made sure he caught the first ship back home. Then, because he arrived before the rest of the crew, he got to set the tone for the whole conversation about the mutiny. In his account, Christian and the mutineers were vicious pirates. He was faultless, and what everyone should focus on was his miraculous 4,000-mile open boat journey. Huh? Well, both the Admiralty and the public ate that story up. In October of 1790, he was acquitted of all charges and became a national hero. In fact, there was so much of an appetite for details of his journey that Bligh planned to write a book about it. But since no one could wait that long, in the meantime, he published a 25-page account with, and I just gotta say this up top, the most 18th century title one could think of. Okay, here we go. Deep breath. A narrative of the mutiny on board His Majesty's ship Bounty and the subsequent voyage of part of the crew in the ship's boat from Tofua, one of the friendly islands, to Timor, a Dutch settlement in the East Indies. Yeah, Georgians had a real kink for long titles. But one way that Bligh got both the Admiralty and the public on his side was to emphasize the more scandalous aspects of the tale and suggest that the mutineers had become racially other. He emphasized that the mutineers had slept with Tahitian women, which, let's be clear, the loyalists also did, and had received Polynesian tattoos, a thing associated with native populations and official marks made on criminals. Bligh was essentially suggesting that the mutineers had given up their whiteness, Christianity, and obedience to law, as opposed to his supposedly unblemished loyalist crew. And these remarks were not subtle, especially since he kept referring to Christian as, quote, blackish. So Bligh was made a hero. Ooh, and what was his great reward? I am so glad you asked. He got to, drumroll please, go on another voyage and get breadfruit from Tahiti and bring it to the West Indies! Yeah, basically he got to take a mulligan. Look, whatever else you can say about Bligh, the guy had follow-through. And for what it's worth, he was successful this time, delivering the plants to the West Indies in a 2-year mission. But adding to the futility of the story, breadfruit actually never caught on as a food for enslaved people, though it has become popular in Caribbean cooking today. But before Bligh took that second ride on the Breadfruit Express, the crew of the HMS Pandora left on a manhunt to the other side of the world. Honestly, it went great. They rounded South America with no issue, and within hours of arriving in Tahiti, the 3 prisoners from the start of this episode had surrendered. Interrogating the men, they learned that 11 more mutineers were living on Tahiti, and within a few days, they'd enlisted the help of Tahiti's king and captured all of them. Now, this only accounted for part of the mutinous crew. 9 men, including Fletcher Christian, were still on the lam, but the story Pandora's captain, Edward Edwards, yes, really, extracted from those they'd caught so far, sounded incredible. After setting Bligh and his loyalists adrift, they said the mutineers had tried to formulate a plan. Most wanted to go back to Tahiti and live there, but that risked capture the next time a British ship came into port. After all, Tahiti was becoming a more frequent stop, and mutiny was a capital crime. Therefore, Christian decided they should settle an island called Tubuai, around 300 miles south of Tahiti, which was too small to attract attention. Believing it would be important to impress the islanders, and perhaps disguise them if sighted, they cut up a sail to make new white uniforms. But his initial settlement attempt went poorly. Several islanders came aboard on their arrival, but when he caught one of them stealing, Christian had him flogged. Then when a group retaliated, Christian opened up on their canoes with grape shot, killing a dozen villagers. You know, the exact kind of thing Bligh was trying to avoid last episode when he disallowed Christian from going ashore with arms when he was getting water. Anyway, after reconnoitering the island, the mutineers decided it was still an ideal spot. It had everything they needed to survive and was just lightly populated. But Christian also realized his crew didn't have enough supplies to make a real settlement. So they went back to Tahiti to, essentially, con the king who'd been generous to them in the past. Christian told the king that Captain Cook, a popular figure among Tahitians who still believed he was alive, was coming to make a settlement but needed livestock. Oh, also they'd like to take some women with them. Okay? In the end, only 9 women, including a few like Christian's partner, who he called Isabella, would come along serving as, quote, wives. But the mutineers also left with over 400 pigs, 50 goats, chickens, a bull and cow, and dogs and cats, the latter imported by Europeans. Also, 8 Tahitian men and 10 boys joined or stowed away as translators. This settlement went better than the first, with the Tahitians serving as intermediaries. But their group had inflamed tensions between the island's 3 chiefs, and when they started to build a massive European-style earth fort, rumors started among the islanders that the fort's moat was part of a plan to massacre the villages nearby and bury them in a mass grave. Then the islanders attacked, leading to a battle that killed over 60 native villagers, including women. That was enough for the mutineers, who had not signed up for tribal warfare. There was also jealousy among them since not all the mutineers had a, quote, wife. So they took a vote. They'd split the party. Always a great decision. 16, including the loyalists, voted to go back to Tahiti and settle, while 9 wanted to stay on the run with Christian. So Christian dropped the men off, took on supplies, and enticed several native Tahitian women aboard for the night. Then he quietly cut the anchor cable while the women slept and slipped out before dawn. On the beach, family members of the women wailed and struck their heads with rocks at the kidnapping. One woman jumped overboard and managed to swim back to shore. And that, the prisoners said, was the last they saw of Fletcher Christian. Edwards and the Pandora combed the Pacific for signs of the Bounty. But apart from a few spars washed up on a small island, there was no sign. One shore party even disappeared and never came back. Nothing. It was time to head home. Meanwhile, the prisoners roasted in irons within Pandora's box, unable to stretch, not eating properly, getting weak, until HMS Pandora had snagged on the Great Barrier Reef and ripped out its bottom. Crewmen panicked. 4 prisoners were released to work pumps, while the rest screamed to be let free as the crew piled onto boats. Only as the deck was slanting and the ship going under did anyone throw open the hatch of Pandora's box, with the armorer coming in to strike off their chains, though he couldn't get to all of them before the ship went under. 4 prisoners, including the loyalist midshipman George Stewart, drowned along with 33 crew. The next morning saw Thomas Hayward in a familiar position, having been put out with Bligh only 16 months before on a harrowing open boat journey. He was again stranded at sea, facing another harrowing open boat journey along the exact same route. Ironically, when they got to the Dutch port, they were met by the same officials and got a ride back to England on a boat laden with botanical and zoological samples meant for Joseph Banks. You know, the guy who'd suggested the breadfruit mission in the first place. Against all odds, considering the poor conditions they endured, the remaining 10 mutineers actually managed to make it back to England for a court-martial. Originally, the Navy considered charging them with piracy, but this was quickly dropped to simple mutiny. 4 of the 10, recorded on Bligh's list as loyalists, were acquitted immediately. Then the next 3 were pretty clearly guilty, but that guilt was a little less sure for the last 3. The assistant cook had a letter from an old captain testifying to his character, the tailor managed to hire a lawyer, and honorary midshipman Peter Heywood's family engaged in aristocratic contacts to lobby on his behalf, arguing his extreme youth meant he felt confused and under threat from Christian. They also may have paid some bribes for testimony, but much of the defense focused on either smearing Bligh or their ill treatment by Edwards on Pandora. In the end, all 6 were convicted and sentenced to death, but even the judges stated that Heywood and the cook should receive a royal pardon, and the tailor got his conviction overturned on appeal. So ultimately, only 3 men were hung. Bligh, away collecting breadfruit, was not present for any of this, and when he returned in 1791, he found his heroic reputation in tatters. And a public campaign by Heywood's family had brought to light his erratic and supposedly tyrannical nature. And for the rest of his life, he'd be known by that first nickname his old crew gave him, the Bounty Bastard. Captain Edwards, meanwhile, survived his own court-martial, only to be smeared in the same manner, excoriated for his poor treatment of the prisoners, especially those Bligh had named as innocent. Peter Heywood went on to a distinguished Royal Navy career, serving in the Napoleonic Wars, retiring as a captain, and publishing a Tahitian dictionary. And he was still alive in 1810, when the world finally discovered what had become of Fletcher Christian. Previously, public speculation had been hot. Imagined versions of Christian's adventures cast him as a sort of Robinson Crusoe character. Out civilizing some wild part of the Pacific or living like a king. The truth was nothing so romantic. In 1808, the American seal ship Topaz decided to stop at a remote island called Pitcairn, 1,350 miles east-southeast of Tahiti. Then a canoe paddled out to greet them, containing 1 man and several Tahitian women. That man was John Adams, the last surviving bounty mutineer. And the story he told was horrific. After leaving Tahiti, Christian had sailed to an island that Cook had surveyed, the aforementioned Pitcairn. It had no harbor, was uninhabited, and had enough materials for sustaining life. And crucially, it was also plotted on charts incorrectly, making it difficult to find. He landed with his 8 remaining mutineers, a group of Tahitian women he'd kidnapped, and a group of Tahitian men and boys that they hoped to use as community members, laborers, and servants. And once ashore, they stripped everything usable from Bounty, then burned it to prevent it from being sighted. Heck, the next year, Pandora passed right by without spotting them. For 3 years, the mutineers built houses, started families, and settled down. But as disease began to take its toll, tensions increased both between mutineers and the Tahitian men. Several mutineers increasingly treated the Tahitians as slaves to be exploited and traded, and after a few of the women died, jealousy over who owned which wife led to violence. In a rash of vendetta killings and uprisings, most of the mutineers and all of the Tahitian men were killed. According to his wife, Isabella, Christian himself was shot from behind while tending his garden. The remaining mutineers and several Tahitian women then massacred the remaining Tahitian men. There had, essentially, been a mutiny against the mutineers, and now Adams was the only one left. The story reached England in 1810, causing 2 frigates to stop at Pitcairn in 1814. There, they met Fletcher Christian's adult son, Thursday October Christian, and learned that Adams had taught the community to read English and converted them to Christianity. Given this, the Royal Navy, deep in the Napoleonic Wars by this point, decided not to punish Adams. Indeed, when he died in 1831, he was actually held up as a symbol of Victorian moralism. By that time, the mutiny on the Bounty had already become a maritime legend, a story of power, sex, abuse, endurance, and rebellion that has continued to fascinate us for more than 2 centuries after it occurred. But while films about bounty often boil it down to a morality tale about power or the lure of a different way of life, the truth is the forces that tore bounty apart were complicated. They were ideas of military discipline, social class, masculine honor, and human rights. Culture clashes not only of Britain and the Pacific Islands, but of merchant sailors and the Royal Navy. Notions of justice and fairness, and how you should treat men presumed to be innocent, and looming above it all, how easily even young men with little experience of the British Empire could slip into the role of colonizer. It truly is one of the greatest tales of the high seas, the Mutiny on the Bounty. A story that shows us just how important nuance is when trying to accurately follow complex world events. Case in point, while perusing headlines on Ground News the other day, I saw a bunch of different takes on the current King of England's recent visit to the Canadian Parliament. So many takes, in fact. But Ground News helped me pull back the media bias curtain. Every day, they collect and organize thousands of news articles to show you exactly how news stories are being covered across the political spectrum via their super handy visual breakdown of every story's political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. So with that in mind, sailing back to the royal visit, Ground News made it easy for me to compare headlines and see how organizations' biases were affecting framing. One right-leaning headline said, "King Charles warns Canada faces unprecedented challenge during official trip," while on the left a headline read, "King Charles fires warning shot to Trump amid Canada threats in historic speech." You can see we got some varying tones there. Ground News also has a blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered from one side of the political spectrum, helping you burst out of your own news bubble. I know it's helped me. So if you'd like help sifting through all that daily misinformation and bias in your news, we can get you fine folks 40% off a Vantage subscription to Ground News for a limited time by going to ground.news/extra and clicking the link in the description or scanning that old QR code right there on the screen to get unlimited access to all their features. Again, for a way better newsfeed, click or scan right here, and then once you're in the know, check out our next video here. Once upon a time, Angelo Valenciana, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, Lotus Wolf, and Ziliad's architectures were phenomenal legendary patrons, and that's no myth.